if you guys don't, if you don't mind me to go before you, Louis. So basically, I've been asking CNCF, can we run a Istio Developer Summit on that Monday, and ask if they have space. Unfortunately, they just got back to me, said they don't have space on that Monday. They ask would another day work. My intuition is probably not, given Tuesday is Istio Day. I think people are pretty busy on KubeCon, so I was just planning to let them know if it's not on Monday, we won't hold the developer summit. Does anyone have any objections to that? Thoughts?
So we also had our ContribFest application denied. We might want to push back, and say it's a little rough for a graduated project to be told no on ContribFest and no on Developer Summit.
Yeah. Then should we give Craig a Craig run with that one?
Yeah, to push back. Yeah, maybe he's in the best position because he represents all the maintainers now. Okay, so let him know. But I did went to the Contribute Fest schedule. I don't see Cilium was picked. This year, I think they changed their strategy because a lot of projects they picked were not very famous. So, but they did pick like Cilium or Istio in Chicago. So that may be why. But if you guys think there is interest to have the summit in another day other than Monday, I can let them know. And then we can have Craig push back to say, hey, look, we're a graduate project. Can we get a slot on the Contribute Fest?
Yeah, I think that's the route to go. I think most of us are going to have booth duty and talks we have to attend and Istio booth duty and everything else. So I don't know where we would fit in a summit on top of that.
Okay, sounds good. So I'll do that. Just say we're only interested on Monday, and I'll mention this to Craig, see if he can help us push back.
I don't know about you guys. I've already booked travel to be there on Monday. Maybe that means we just need to do Istio team building on Monday.
Yeah.
Maybe a paddle boat on the Seine, or
yeah,
our appreciation walk. I don't know.
A bike. All right, I think I'm done with this topic. Thank you for hearing me on that.
I'll go a very small related PSA. Istio is now a part of the CNCF Enterprise GitHub org, which means that I think all members should be able to spin up code spaces that will be paid for by the Linux Foundation for the Istio project. The overall intent of this is that we support, well, it was for ContribFest in Europe, which sounds like now is not happening. But long term, we'd love to be able to have ContribFest where users get up and running with a working IDE in like 2 to 3 minutes. We had those who were not able to use code spaces in Detroit. I don't think ever got a working IDE running locally because the Wi-Fi was so bad.
Yes, that's correct.
So anyways, if you have any trouble with that, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I won't be able to answer them yet because I'm still figuring it out myself. But yeah, should be having access to code spaces now.
Cool. Thanks so much for that update. I'll mention this to Craig Box too. Maybe that could be another reason to push back.
Sounds good.
Yeah. All right, Louis, do you want to talk about the design doc?
Sure. Yeah.
Actually, Louis, you want to take over the presentation?
No, sure. Let me do that.
I figure it's easier than asking me to scroll down or something.
Right. No, that is very fair. All right. How's that looking for everybody?
Looks good.
So this document is about the API that we use to tell the Z-tunnel layer when to send traffic through waypoints. And there are two types of traffic that we do that for in any mesh: service traffic and what we call to-workload traffic. And so the API right now is two annotations. The first, which is waypoint 4, and it says it's an annotation used on a gateway to say that it's a waypoint for a set of traffic within the namespace that the gateway is defined. And it can be a waypoint for all services, which means all service traffic, but not all to-workload traffic. All traffic, which includes to-workload traffic and all services, or explicit, which means you have to say which things go through that waypoint. And if you don't, nothing goes through it. And that's what the second annotation for, which is use waypoint. And it is used to annotate things like services and deployments and say, I want my traffic to go through a waypoint, right? And you say what that waypoint is in the value of the annotation. And you can either say none, and you can use none to opt out, right? So if you use a waypoint 4 that is all services, you can annotate a specific service and say none, and then that traffic for that service won't go through the waypoint. And you can name a specific gateway. And keen observers will note that you can use a short form name, which allows you to name a gateway in the same namespace. You can use a long form name and name a gateway in another namespace. Not clear if we necessarily want to support that in the short term, but that would allow us to support gateways or waypoints that were multi-tenant effectively. There are reasons not to do multi-tenant gateways, as we've elaborated in the past, but there are also reasons to do them. And so I've made it an option in the API, or at least in the API design at least, even if it may not be a recommendation in production, or certainly not a recommendation for default behavior. And that's the API. There are then a few other things that are consequences of the API and the waypoint pattern that I discussed in the document. Probably the most obviously immediately important one of these is the interplay between waypoints and authorization policy. And there's still a bit of debate going on about the best way to do this. But we want to be able to make sure that we can clearly identify the waypoint in authorization policy. And the best way to do that is to refer to the waypoint service account. That's the most unambiguous way to do it because it's the way we do it for everything else. And the recommendation is that the waypoint should have its own service account and not reuse a service account. So why would that be an issue? So let's say you have a namespace and the default service account, and you run 5 workloads under the default service account, and you also run the waypoint under it. Then you can't tell the difference between traffic coming from the waypoint and traffic coming from one of those other workloads at the L4 level. Right, and so it's not clear and unambiguous when I want to say, I only want traffic that goes to the waypoint to go to my workload. You can't actually do that. But if the waypoint has its own service account, then you can. And so that is why this is now the recommendation. So then there's a discussion, hopefully folks have looked at this before. We talk about basically 2 different types of waypoints. There's the waypoints that Istio will provide out of the box, which are fully automated and lots of wonderful things. And then there are waypoints that you can manually create yourself. And so there's a discussion about how we decide if you have a gateway resource that you want to be a waypoint, and you configure it with listeners and everything else, how do we know, based on the annotations and the services and other configuration resources in the namespace, which listener on the gateway traffic should go to? So there's a set of rules describing how that's done. And then there's an example kind of giving you or describing how you would do this, right? So there's a gateway resource. It's implemented by an Nginx controller. It's got 2 listeners, foo and bar. Those listeners are actually the same, the listener names are the same names as services in the namespace. And then there's the usual stuff that you would put in the gateway resource, like routes, sending traffic to foo v1 and v2 and bar and stuff like that. And what Istio will be able to do by looking at those listener names, it will know, oh, you want traffic coming into foo to go through this waypoint and into bar to go through this waypoint to those listeners. And we describe how we make that matchup. And there's still some to-dos in here. And then we describe how you should set up authorization policy to ensure that traffic to foo and bar only go through the waypoint. And we use the waypoint's new service account to do that. And so we kind of refer to this as stock and non-stock waypoints, non-stock being basically any gateway resource or controlled gateway implementation can act as a waypoint, and how the lower layer will integrate with it. So this entire document is describing behavior of Z-tunnel. It gives examples of gateways as L7 things, but what it's really describing is an API to control the behavior of Z-tunnel and how it directs traffic to waypoints or not. And that's what the API is designed to control. Then there's a description of how we do that for to workload traffic, not just for to service traffic. We talk, because it's a normal gateway, and the Nginx one that we gave an example of, you could use any Nginx policy with it, just like you would for the gateway API specification. And then I go through kind of operational examples and kind of configuration examples for common use cases. There's quite a lot in here, but the concepts themselves are relatively straightforward, but the consequences of them they need to be understood by everybody. So I would definitely recommend that people take a long look at this. There are still some discussions and decisions, particularly around authorization policy, that are in flight. And I'd certainly welcome a lot of feedback on the operational side, where those open decisions have quite a large usability impact. So yeah, so that's all. So this is an iteration of the doc John produced back in early December discussing this, but now fleshed out quite considerably to the point that it's at least reasonably implementable. That's probably enough of an overview. Questions?
Louis, I have a high-level question. Does this doc effectively supplant the others that we've seen so far?
So there are 3 docs that are current, although one I haven't had a chance to go and update yet. So there's the authorization policy status document, which I will also dump in the agenda. So that one is the latest on authorization policy, and then there's the layering and conformance document, which is still current but needs a lot of update based on this document. So I would just recommend people read the auth-z and the capture document at the moment. I should probably go through some of the other docs that are effectively deprecated and moved from as such. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure. Some people have asked, why would you want to allow a multi-tenant waypoint? You could certainly think of a few circumstances where that might make sense. Obviously, if you're worried about noisy neighbor problems, they don't make a lot of sense. But if you're not worried about noisy neighbor problems, and you have confidence in your ability to isolate yourself from them, then it might make sense, right? One obvious case is you got a very resource-constrained development environment, right? Where running 60 or 70 envoys, right, might not make a ton of sense when you're only sending a few QPS through the environment. And it would probably have some startup and maintenance advantages in that case. You could also probably make the same argument for small prepackaged kind of edge Kubernetes deployments, right, on small form factor, right, where the whole form factor is kind of security analyzed before being deployed to an edge environment. And you just don't want to consume a bunch of resources for low traffic. And so you could see it making sense in that case. And then obviously, if you're providing the gateway as a SaaS solution, users don't really know what you're doing behind the curtain anyway. So it's exercise left up to the SaaS implementer how they want to do isolation and security versus keeping their resource consumption costs under control. So those are the three situations I think it could make some sense. But in kind of stock enterprisey, I run Kubernetes on a bunch of nodes, it probably doesn't make sense. Another one is if you have namespaces, but they're really owned by the same organization, right? So that the trust boundary is a little wider than a single namespace, right? So you have namespace v1 and namespace v2. You have that kind of model, then it might make sense there too, right? But it's not cluster wide; it's more specifically scoped. Again, as a resource saving, but only if that's material.
Louis, am I understanding you correctly? You're saying there's a way for the gateway to indicate what services are allowed to specifically reference it as their gateway?
Yes. So I give an example. So for those not familiar with the Gateway API, it has this thing called a reference grant. So you can see here, create a gateway in a namespace called shared infra, right? Just to make it clear that this is designed to be a shared one. And in the same namespace, you create a reference grant saying, this namespace is allowed to reference this resource in my namespace, right? And then what you do is you create a gateway resource in your own namespace, and you say, I want to use the waypoint in the other namespace. Because it's been reference granted, this is now effectively a marker saying, hey, I want to be part of that other shared infrastructure. And then the Istio controller, because this is an Istio provided one, will know what to do.
So this second gateway doesn't actually get a deployment spun up behind it. It's just like a symlink, effectively.
Yes, effectively, yeah. But it works well with the reference grant mechanism defined in the Gateway API specification. So that's why I used Gateway to do this. But this actually is probably somewhat fresh off the press. So reviews of this are expected. And we may not do it, right? Like there's also that, right? But I just wanted to make sure that the API allowed for if we wanted to do it down the road.
And then
that's cool. Go ahead.
If we had this use waypoint in a different namespace, or referring to a waypoint in a different namespace, but the target waypoint did not have that explicit type that you showed above, that means that binding would not work. Is that correct?
Right, and we would write status to the gateway resource that was making the reference and say that that was not live.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you.
So one of the things missing in the doc is calling out how we're going to provide all the status information for this, right? Which we're trying to be good citizens with respect to the Gateway API specification in providing clear and unambiguous status for states and behaviors. So that's missing. There's a to-do for a bunch of that. And that's actually also true in the ODZ document. In fact, the ODZ document is almost entirely about providing status. Anyway, there's obviously a lot here to digest, and it represents a non-trivial amount of change from the existing alpha deployment of Ambient. But based on lots of reviews and what we've heard in terms of the APIs and the need for some greater control, this seems like the direction that makes sense. Anyway, I'm happy to spend time answering questions about it. But if people don't have questions and just want to go and read, that's also fine too. And we can address them offline or in Slack, etc. And I can give back time for whatever other agenda people want to talk about.
Louis, would the hope be that we can have this in proof of concept form or some sort of initial form in the 122 release, which is, I think?
I would hope so, yes. the actual API itself is not particularly complicated. The status maintenance and obviously the controller work that needs to happen for Istio Waypoint obviously represents a non-trivial chunk of work, but it's probably not a huge increment over what we're already doing in many respects. The sandwich work that Stephen is doing is necessary to unblock the non-stock gateway cases. So that one may or may not make sense to prioritize versus the stock ones, but there's certainly people who would like to see the non-stock stuff work as well. And it's certainly a powerful proof of concept to be able to show people. So we have a lot of the pieces of this already. Yeah, so the goal is to try and at least make what needs to be implemented very clear, so that we're just mostly reviewing PRs rather than designs.
This seems pretty cool.
Thank you. Anyway, if anyone, feel free to ask me questions on Slack or wherever else, and put comments in the doc. I am also waiting for John and Keith to provide comments. They're obviously some of the major reviewers for this, so but they're at their website too. So. I would like to get this and the authorization policy document close to signed off in the next week or two. Okay.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much, Louis.
All right. Do we have any other agenda?
I don't believe so.
All right. Well, happy Wednesday, everybody.
Thank you, folks.
Yeah, thanks everybody.